Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third and final episode of the mini-series on the podcast titled The Judean Revolt with Professor Guy Rogers, with this third and final episode being titled Masada and the Legacies of the Great Revolt. This series is based on Professor Rogers' new book titled For the Freedom of Zion, The Great Revolt of Jews Against Romans, 66 to 74 CE, published by Yale University Press. And once again, as mentioned on the previous two episodes, is focused on a purely historical look at what happened based on the classical sources, mainly being Josephus and others. So once again, not a hashkafic or Chazal-based discussion. I'll mention here, if anyone's interested in listening to something more on that, on Agarata and Chazal and the Chorban, they can check out a recent episode I did with Yaakov Beer about his newly published Sefer Be'ikvei HaGolos. Back to this mini-series, in the first episode of the series, we discussed Herod and Horus and his reign and what happened until the outbreak of the war. The second episode focused on the war itself, what happened in Yerushalayim up until the Chorban HaBayis, the destruction of the temple. And this episode, episode 3, focuses on the aftermath of the Chorban, what happens in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael, culminating with Masada, and also we do detour and discuss what happens in Rome as Titus returns to Rome, and the amphitheater, the Coliseum, which is the Flavian Amphitheater, as well as the Arch of Titus, of Titus, as those are familiar with, again, culminating with Masada and much other discussion in the episode. So I would like to thank, once again, the sponsor of the entire series, alephbeta.org. This Tisha B'Av, to make your Tisha B'Av experience more meaningful, I encourage you to check out Aleph Beta's collection of Tisha B'Av videos. Rabbi David Fohrman, who's the founder of Aleph Beta and was a guest on the podcast, and his videos explore some of the most beloved Tisha B'Av texts to discover the deeper meaning and relevance of the day. And for listeners of the podcast, for a limited time only, you can get an $18 off an annual Aleph Beta membership, which is one free month, which will give you access to all the Tisha B'Av videos, plus hundreds more on Parsha and other holidays. All you need to do is go to alephbeta.org, that's ALEPHBETA.org, and enter coupon code SFARIM22. Once again, coupon code SFARIM22, SEFORIM22, for $18 of an annual premium membership, which is, again, one free month. And for those that aren't familiar, you can check out Aleph Beta. They have many videos on a wide range of topics, and they are cartoon videos with Torah. It's very interesting. So for those not familiar, I encourage you to check it out, and you can click the link in the show's notes. Also, for Professor Rogers' book, For the Freedom of Zion, there'll be a link in the show's notes, as well as a link to Josephus' Jewish War and some other books that we discussed in the show. And as I mentioned in the last episode, Farm Chatter now is part of Amazon Associates, so if you want to use those links to help support Farm Chatter, I very much appreciate it. And as always, if anyone has any questions, comments, or feedback, they can email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com, or if you would like to support the show or to sponsor an episode, email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com, or check out the website, svarmchatter.com, and there's a link on there as well. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast, and the final episode of the mini-series on the Chorban, and on once again I'm being joined on this series and then this episode Professor Guy Rogers, who is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Classics and History at Wellesley College, and the book that the discussion is based on, loosely or more so, is For the Freedom of Zion, The Great Revolt of Jews Against Romans, published by Yale University Press. And as with the other episodes, the link to purchase the book will be in the show's notes. So thank you, Professor Rogers, for joining me once again.
Well, thank you for having me.
Okay, so last episode, the second episode, we kind of ended off where the Chorban, which is the burning of the temple of the Beis HaMikdash, was burning, and we kind of ended around over there. So let's pick up over there and the aftermath of the destruction.
Right. So, of course, the burning of the temple was a major event in Roman and Jewish history and in world history as well. The sad thing is that the destruction didn't stop, as it were, with the burning of the temple. In the aftermath of that, the Romans actually destroyed some of the other major buildings in Jerusalem, like the chamber where the Sanhedrin met. And then they started sort of wider destruction in the lower city and in the upper city, and there was a large massacre of the population. And Josephus says that when that was over with, that Titus ordered the Roman soldiers to raise the temple itself, that is, knock it over, or what remained of it after the burning. And, visitors to Jerusalem and the Western Wall, the Herodian retaining wall, probably have noticed some of those huge sort of monolithic stones lying out in front of the Herodian retaining wall in the street. Those are actually the stones that are probably the most intimately connected to the architecture of the Temple Mount itself, not the retaining wall, but what there was up on top of the wall. And it always strikes me as ironic when I walk by there, because everybody, of course, is at the retaining wall, and I'm pointing over, in the distance to these stones that were actually part of what there was up there. But anyway, there was a pretty comprehensive destruction of the city, and then also of the survivors of the initial massacres. Josephus says that the Romans executed the so-called brigands. They spared some young men to walk in the triumphal march of Titus and Vespasian, and another group, 11,000 or so, who sort of survived while the Romans were trying to figure out what to do with them, apparently starved to death. And then some of the men of sort of fighting age were sent around to kind of the arenas, the amphitheaters in the eastern cities of the Roman Empire to, fight against each other to the death, or to fight against wild animals for the entertainment of the local population. So a pretty brutal outcome, and then series of sort of punishments of people in the aftermath of the destruction.
Now, do we know, so numbers wise, Josephus discusses how many were taken prisoner and how many were killed in Jerusalem alone? And just once you're going to talk about those numbers, how accurate are those numbers really that Josephus gives?
Right. So Josephus says that there were 97,000 people enslaved during the war, and 1.1 million people who died during the Roman siege of Jerusalem. It's really hard to know. These are sort of large, rounded off numbers. I think it's much more likely that number of 97,000 enslaved has some basis in reality, because, as I think I mentioned last time, the Romans tended to keep very careful records of the number of people that were captured and then sold into slavery during their wars. The 1.1 million, I think the figure of the 1.1 million is kind of a reflection of the idea that there were a large number of people who were in Jerusalem at the time, because the siege started during Passover, and elsewhere Josephus talks about very large numbers of people who would visit the city at the time. I seriously doubt that there were 1.1 million people killed there. I don't think there would have been enough room in ancient Jerusalem for 1.1 million people. But I do think if we were thinking on the order of tens of thousands of people killed during the siege, we probably wouldn't be too far off. So.
Right. And just one more. So there was obviously, like you're saying, many, many, many people killed, and a terrible tragedy. Now, about the enslaved, so what happened to them? And in general, when the Romans, this is a Roman historian, and when the Romans would capture people and then sell them as slaves, what would happen to them?
So So women and children were often made kind of into domestic slaves. They worked around the households and things like that. We happen to know that a large number of the men, the Jewish men slaves, were sent to work on kind of imperial projects like mines or agricultural labor. So really, really hard labor. There's a very poignant inscription actually from Italy of which mentions a woman who apparently was sold to a guy, a Roman, and became a member of his household. And her name was in the inscription as Maria. Her real name was probably Miriam. So this is one of the very few examples that we have of a recollection of the identity of an individual who was part of this terrible destruction. When you go to the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, obviously, there are many exhibitions which quite rightly attempt to restore the histories of individuals who perished in the Holocaust. And I think it's sort of tragic and ironic, unfortunately, that in the case of the destruction of the temple and a large part of Jerusalem and some of the other towns and cities during this revolt during the Roman Empire, we know about the fates of kind of a handful of individuals, and all the rest of those people, we really can't know anything about where they were or what happened to them individually. Very sad, actually.
Okay, right. Now to pull you back or actually it feels right in here, something we didn't discuss was that when the date that it was destroyed. I know you discussed about Chazal, the rabbis, and then you have Josephus discussing this. So something that you want to mention.
Right. So, according to Josephus, the end of the temple, the burning down of the temple was on the 10th of Lus or Ab. Because that Josephus uses these sort of adjusted Macedonian and Hebrew calendar. Rabbinic sources, everyone will know, date the destructions of both the first and the second temple to the 9th. So there's a little bit of difference about the dating of it. I think that, part of that may have to do actually with the real physical destruction itself, because these were buildings made out of monumental stones, and they didn't just burn down in a few hours. The fires we know that destroyed the temple and the Temple Mount went on for a good long time. So that may be that. I actually believe that may be part of the difference in the dating as well.
Right. That the fire was burning, I think, till the next day, till the 10th.
Yeah, yeah.
That's why people. Right. That's why we still do stuff the next day. Right. Okay. So now getting back to till post destruction. So at this point, as we'll get to the Arch of Titus in a little bit, but they take out the vessels, they take out everything from the Beis Hamikdash, from the temple. So talk about that and what happens at that point and what they plundered, so to speak.
Right. So, as I said last time, Titus went into the temple. Josephus doesn't really say that he saw anything there, and to me that makes a lot of sense, because I believe that most of the treasures of the temple had probably been removed when it became clear that the temple was going to be captured by the Romans, and we happen to know, in fact, that there were kind of multiple examples of some of these these treasures, like the menorahs. There wasn't just one menorah, and in any case, the menorah that's shown on the frieze on the Arch of Titus is a representation of a menorah. We don't know which one it was, but definitely the idea was that it came from the temple. But some of those anyway were taken to Rome as sort of booty from the temple, and were displayed during the triumph, the processional triumph through the streets of Rome by the Romans in the triumph of Titus and Vespasian, and subsequently were put in the so-called Temple of Peace, which Vespasian had built in Rome. And some of them were there, we know, for centuries, were seen by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So, that was sort of standard Roman practice. Vespasian called it a temple of peace, but it was a practice that went back to the Roman Republican period, that conquering Roman generals had erected monuments to their victories inside of the city of Rome.
Right, and this is not exactly the place for this, but I'll just mention this or ask this. As for the myth or the legend that everything's still in, the Vatican, it still exists. But Rome was sacked so many times, they're probably gone. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, there are stories in later sources about what happened with some of the temple artifacts. We know that some of them were taken out of Rome during late antiquity. What happened after that, nobody is really sure. But as I say to my students, that we know that, for instance, Alexander the Great was buried finally in Alexandria. If you find the Ark of the Covenant or the Temple Menorah, you automatically are going to become the most famous archaeologist in world history. So I think it would be pretty amazing if some of those treasures turned up. You never know. You should never say never. We'll see.
Okay, so now as for the other, the famous figures that we were discussing, and what happens were other captured, killed in this aftermath.
Right. So in the immediate aftermath, there was kind of a negotiation between some of the rebel leaders and Titus and the Roman army. And so some of the rebel leaders, such as John of Giscala, were captured. In fact, we don't know exactly what happened to John. We assume that he was taken to Rome and was part of the triumphal procession in June of 71. But Josephus doesn't say that. Simon, who was probably the most effective rebel leader, went underground when the temple, or after probably the temple fell, and had a plan with some other guys to sort of continue digging through one of these tunnels to escape clearly beyond the Roman lines. But they either ran out of food, or it turned out to be too difficult a project, and he sort of popped out of the ground and was captured by the Romans. And Josephus does say that he was brought to to Rome and marched as a captive in the procession. And at the end of the procession, at the base of the Capitoline Hill, in this small sort of prison area, a sort of cave-like area that the Romans used for prominent prisoners, he was killed. He was strangled, which was, one of these appalling Roman customs that they had with defeated generals or leaders in wars. In my book, I point out kind of the irony of that. If it's true that Simon's father was a convert to Judaism, that the son of a convert, should sort of be selected as the symbol of the revolt itself, and made into kind of the scapegoat, as it were, for the revolt.
Yeah. Now, so after this, obviously, unfortunately, the terrible tragedy, the destruction, and what's going on in Jerusalem now. What happens? What do the Romans, do to Jerusalem as a whole? Who becomes in charge, or what happens? And as they pull out, and as Titus heads back to Rome, what happens throughout the country as they head out?
Right. So, if you read older scholarly books about Jerusalem after the war, you would have found people saying that Jerusalem was sort of emptied of Jews. That's probably not true. There were some Jews, we now believe, on the basis of epigraphical evidence, living in the city, living around the city itself, probably serving Roman troops, because we know that after the destruction of the temple and large parts of the city, that the Romans decided that they would station the Roman 10th Legion in the city itself. And they sort of changed the system of administration there as well. They, for the first time, appointed, instead of either a prefect or a procurator, they appointed a legate, just like there used to be, or was still, a legate up in Syria. Legates were usually people who were in charge of Roman legions. So essentially, the takeaway about Jerusalem and Judea administratively is that it becomes militarized in the wake of what happened up to 70 or 71. So now for the first time, instead of kind of locally recruited auxiliary troops supposedly keeping the peace in this area, you have a Roman legion there. And in the aftermath of that, as happened in so many other places in the Roman Empire, when legionaries retired after their service, their 20, 25 years of service, then a lot of them stayed in the area, and many of them settled in Caesarea or other places. We have a lot of inscriptions which talk about their careers and all of that. So, this is part of kind of the transformation of this area. There were still many Jews living in this area who had a lot of property, working, in agriculture and all the rest. But this is definitely a militarized zone in the aftermath of what happened.
Right. And now what happens? So what does happen to a lot of these Jews in the rest of Israel or in other surrounding countries?
Right. So we actually have less information about the immediate vicinity of Jerusalem. We do know, on the basis of archaeological finds, which sort of signal that there are Jews there who are practicing their religion. Famously, supposedly one group of Jews go to Yamnia or Yavna and begin this process of kind of interpreting the destruction of the temple and the aftermath of it. So there are, the everyday ordinary people who are still going about their business. 90% of the people, both Jews and non-Jews, their everyday lives are about subsistence agriculture. But of course, there are other people who are literate and who are continuing these traditions as well. If you open the lens a bit wider and look into the other provinces, the big change is that in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, the Flavians halt the collection of the temple tax and instead impose on Jews throughout the Roman provinces a 2 denarii donation to a fund originally to help rebuild the temple of Capitoline Jupiter in Rome, but it gets extended and it becomes, frankly, kind of a punitive tax, which is collected into the reign or past the reign of Domitian. It got halted under briefly by the Emperor Nerva, but then was reinstituted afterward and was collected into the 3rd century. So the sad part of the sad story, which a colleague has called the Via Dolorosa, is of this sort of prolonged diminution of the status, including the legal status, actually, of Jews living in the provinces of the Roman Empire. And in the original version of my book, in addition to the 400 pages about the Hasmonean period, there was another 60 or 70 pages about the period from the early 2nd century to the time of the Islamic conquests, actually. So a long period of time, but basically looking at the progressive degradation of the legal position of Jews in the provinces of the Roman Empire.
I mean, that's interesting. That sounds a lot like, the Jew tax that would be instituted later. I mean, is this like the roots, or at least the progression of anti-Semitism? Maybe there's something we'll talk about at the end, the conclusion of your book, but this is kind of what a lot of that sounds like.
Yeah, it's I think it is part of the story of anti-Semitism. I mean, it's a very, very complex topic because we know, for instance, that in the city of Rome itself, before the revolt and the destruction of the temple, that there were tens of thousands of Jews living there. We know that a large part of that population lived in the area called what today is called Trastevere. And there isn't that much evidence for sort of anti-Jewish rhetoric or certainly legal punishments or anything like that. As a matter of fact, Judaism was a illicit religion in the Roman Empire, and that was true even after the destruction of the temple. But you can have a licit religion that is a legal religion, and you can have a legal status in the Roman Empire, but still also have legal disabilities at the same time. So that's kind of the change, as opposed to emerging Christianity in the second half of the first century and afterward in the second century, which didn't have a legal status. Christianity wasn't legal. You couldn't be a Christian, as it were. So, but that's a story. That's a story for a different time.
Yeah, that's a whole sidebar. I just wanted to mention that, pick up what you're saying. Okay, so now getting back to the aftermath. So obviously, Titus heads back to Rome. He takes the stuff, like we said, and what happens then? He gets back to Rome. What's his triumphant, celebration, so to speak? Unfortunately, I don't want to use, but what he, from his point of view,
right?
And Vespasian, the Flavians, and then what happens? Kind of their legacy, also, I guess, especially as it pertains, overall, and as it pertains to the Jews, and just talk about it. And then the arch, obviously the arch is famous, and why was the arch made? I'm throwing a bunch of questions at you, but all that kind of stuff.
Right. So Titus goes back to Rome, actually with Josephus sort of in tow, and the Roman Senate and people, which means effectively the Roman Senate in negotiation with Vespasian, decided that they should have kind of a joint triumph for both Vespasian and his son Titus, which was celebrated in June of 70, and of the kind of a thumbnail sketch of the route of the procession. It's a little bit uncertain. Some of the details are uncertain, but what isn't uncertain about it is what was included in the procession itself. War captives, including Simon, as I mentioned before, kind of marching in front of Vespasian and Titus. For our purposes, probably the two most important elements of the procession were some of the treasures taken from both the temple, but also other things taken from Jerusalem and apparently elsewhere as well. So from the temple, the golden table and the lampstand, and a copy of the laws, or the law, which was marched in the procession, and then curtains and valuable clothing and things like that. Probably, I think possibly some of the vestments that the high priest wore. That's a possibility. And then the Romans in their triumphal processions had like big scaffolds built on which were displayed pictorial representations of scenes from the war itself. So sort of telling the story of the war. So that was the procession went through the streets of Rome. Some historians have estimated that there were upwards of 300,000 people who witnessed the procession. There was a big breakfast beforehand, and then afterward, there were feasts in the evening. So it began over in this area around what's called the Campus Martius, and ended at the Capitoline Hill, which I think is another indication that whatever Titus and Vespasian thought in their minds, which we don't have access to, the fact that that the procession ended essentially, at the temple of Capitoline Jupiter, was meant to send out a message to people that this was in essence a kind of victory of Jupiter and the Roman gods over the God of Israel. I mean, this was a religious message that they were sending as well. So, and then in the aftermath of that, there were buildings that were planned and then put up that made reference architecturally or in inscriptions to the revolt and to the Roman victory. The Temple of Peace, which I mentioned before, which was dedicated in 75. And that's where some of the temple treasures were displayed. It has to be said, amidst other works of art that were sort of taken from other prominent places in Rome, including from the famous big golden house, which Nero was building for himself. So this was, the Temple of Peace was sort of an art gallery cum triumphal space. I mean, when Romans talked about peace, what they meant is a peace after a Roman victory in a war, not, sort of love and peace to all kind of space. Interestingly, the copy of the law, which was apparently taken from Jerusalem, wasn't displayed in the Temple of Peace, but in the imperial palaces up on the Palatine Hill, which is where the Roman emperors had kind of their official residences. And some of the hangings as well from the temple, the embroidered or richly adorned hangings as well. So some of the artifacts were, as it were distributed in the city. Interestingly, and one of the things that I think is sort of underestimated by a lot of historians, of course, 99.9% of the visitors to the city of Rome to this day make a pilgrimage to the so-called Coliseum. Originally, the Coliseum was known as the Flavian Amphitheater. And, this was a place that subsequently became famous for gladiatorial combats and, sort of these mass battles that Roman emperors had staged to entertain the Roman populace. It was opened in 80, so roughly 10 years after the destruction of the temple, through some very clever sort of scholarly detective work. A classical scholar called Gazel Foldy found an inscription, and it was a reused inscription, one that had been sort of reused later on, but underneath the original inscription turned out to date to the Flavian period and referred to the building being built from the spoils of war, which means that at least in part, the original Flavian Amphitheater was advertised to the public who was going in and out of this fantastic structure as being built from war spoils of the Judean War. So this was a war memorial in a certain sense, kind of a victory building of the Flavian dynasty. And as I say in my book, I mean, the Coliseum is the metonym of Rome. It is the thing that people, if you say Rome, that's one of the first images that people have in their mind. And I don't claim that it was wholly built out of the money and spoils that the Romans took from Jerusalem, but in part it was built from those spoils, and that's the message that the Flavians wanted to send to people. And then one other place, of course, that everybody visits is the Roman Forum, which is, of course, where the Arch of Titus is, sort of at the southeastern part of it, along the so-called Via Sacra, the sacred road that goes through the middle of the city of Rome. And we know that this was originally supposed to be a kind of triumphal arch in honor of Titus for his victory. But he kind of died while apparently they were still working on at least some of the ornaments in 81. And it may have been kind of finished as more of a commemorative arch to him, so sort of in his memory. But for us, the most important thing is that the frieze panel, of course, on the southern side of it, shows Titus and Roman soldiers passing through an arch, a decorated arch, preceded by a bound captive, who clearly is a Jew, and the Romans are carrying objects from the temple treasury, including the table, and then cups and receptacles, and some silver trumpets. Some scholars think that those were silver trumpets that were used to call people to prayer or to make sacrifice. And then, of course, most famously, the menorah. So there, for many, many years, scholars argued about whether this was the menorah from the temple. It turns out that there's more than one menorah that's part of the temple treasury. So it doesn't really matter whether this was the menorah. This is a work of art that they are using to try to evoke what the captive treasures were. So, and I just want to pause here and kind of remind your listeners to something that I talked about last time, which was, Josephus's account of the debate about whether Titus destroyed the temple on purpose, and Josephus sort of makes the case that no. The temple was destroyed as a result of Roman soldiers getting out of hand and Titus being unable to stop them and everything. So that was what Josephus was selling to his readers. And Titus, we know, reviewed the copy of Josephus's account of the war. So he seemed to be comfortable with that version of what happened. But on the other hand, here in the Arch of Titus, the message being sent out is not one where Titus is apologizing for carting away from Jerusalem and the temple, the sacred vessels from the temple. So I think that that's something worth pondering. And that's a message which is reinforced by a lost inscription, which originally had been incised on another arch, which was dedicated by the Senate and the Roman people to Titus by early 81 on the so-called hemicycle of the Circus Maximus, which is sort of one of the endpoints of the Circus Maximus on its southeast side. So there was an inscription up there which said that Titus had subdued the race of the Jews and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, which by all generals and kings or races previous to himself, others had attacked either in vain or else not even attempted, all of which was totally untrue. First of all, Titus didn't, as it were, subdue all of the Jews. Everyone will know, of course, that Masada wasn't captured until 73 or 74, so that wasn't true. He didn't destroy the entire city of Jerusalem. And Josephus himself lists 5 previous times that Jerusalem had been captured before the Romans. So obviously this is propaganda, but again, I think it's propaganda that doesn't fit very well with what Josephus has to say about Titus's reluctance to destroy the city of Jerusalem, or a large part of it. So just looking very quickly at the big picture then. So the Flavian dynasty used what they had done to the Jews by 70 or 71 kind of as the legitimation for their rule, and also sort of made sure that people in the city of Rome and visitors to Rome would never be able to overlook that. And, you know, the reality is, to this day, for even casual tourists to Rome, some of these major art monuments, like the Coliseum and the Arch of Titus, are still, as it were, sending out these messages. The last time I was in Rome in January of this year, there were hundreds of people camped in front of the Arch of Titus looking at that frieze. So, you know, it's one of the more successful attempts to project an interpretation of an event from the ancient world that's ever been made by anyone. Unfortunately, the result of the destruction of an incredible building, but there it is. So
first of all, just to pull you back a bit already, the date, what was the date of the procession? You broke up a little. The date of the procession, the triumphant procession, was when?
In June of 71.
Okay. Now, just the arch in general as a monument, was that kind of in Roman history? Was that a common thing after war they would put up an arch, or that was something more unique here?
Right. So in the city of Rome, I mean, if you walk around, you're going to find several of these triumphal arches. The ones that have survived from the Roman Empire. And of course, like everything else in Roman life, there was a kind of competition for who can have the biggest, most elaborate triumphal arch. But putting up these triumphal arches and putting up buildings, in fact, that are, the result of victories over defeated enemies of the Romans, as I said, goes back into the Republican period. So Titus and Vespasian, supposedly by the will of the Senate and the people, were playing an old game, as it were.
Okay, so before you already alluded to Masada, which is how Josephus ends. We'll return there in a minute. But first, we just mentioned Josephus here. I mean, what happens? You said Josephus obviously goes back to Rome. What happens to Josephus at this time?
Right. So he goes to Rome and gets busy writing up his accounts of first the war, the first version of which was written, as he says, in his own language, which may mean Hebrew, but it could also mean Aramaic, to be sent to people living on the eastern side of the Euphrates. That didn't survive. So what we have, of course, is the Greek version. Presumably, what was going on in between 71 or 70 and 79, which is around when the Greek version comes out, is Josephus was working on his Greek. We know he had help, and he was reading a lot of, kind of the historical works of Greek literature, like Thucydides' History in Greek, which was a very difficult text in Greek. So, and he was living in a house. He'd been given a house that Vespasian himself had lived in. So he was given a place, a salary, as it were, to live on, and also property in Judea, which had been somewhere in the Jezreel plain, probably. So, he was set up, as it were, in the city of Rome, where he could work on his, his literary output. So the war, and then his sort of magnum opus, the what we call the Antiquities, but also his life, which was written as kind of an appendix to the Antiquities originally, wasn't separate from it, and then his other works as well.
Okay, so let's get to Masada, which is how Josephus ends his account of the war. And obviously, we just mentioned Josephus, so he wasn't there. For this, he definitely wasn't there. So we can talk about how he knew exactly what happened. But people are probably familiar, but just in case not, where was Masada? When did this happen? And what happened? And we can discuss some of it.
Right. So as I always say to people, the Flavian War, as it were, was not the war of Jews against Romans, because the war didn't really end, as it were, in 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem, because there were people not only at Masada, but at other places as well, like Herodion or Herodium, Machaerus, and then Masada, and actually outside of Josephus, who were kind of on the side of the rebels. It's just that the Romans decided not to pursue some of these people until a few years afterward. So one group, the largest group that we know about, of course, were up on Masada, up on this large, sort of flat-topped mesa over the Dead Sea, and kind of the core of that group had been there since the outbreak of the revolt. When we started in our series, I was saying that one of the relatives of one of the original leaders of the revolt, Menachem, this guy Eleazar, had gone there with some of the Sicarii, apparently, and so they were up there for most of the war. Subsequent scholarship has shown that, in fact, there were lots of different kind of people up on Masada, in addition to the daggermen. There were families, women, children, and probably people who belong to some of the other of the sectarian groupings as well. But obviously, people who wanted to live away from and apart from Roman rule. So the legate is now there in Judea, these Roman military governors with a Roman legion, but the Romans kind of left alone the rebel groups that were in Herodion or Herodium, at Machaerus on the other side of the Jordan River, now in Jordan, and on Masada. For some reason, and we don't really know the reason, Josephus doesn't really tell us, the Romans decided that it was somehow intolerable to have these groups in these places. So they began attacking them either in 73 or 74. And this guy Bassus captured Herodion and Machaerus. And then after he died, his replacement, this guy Flavius Silva, became legate, and it fell to him to try to deal with the Jews who were up on Masada. So Masada had been fortified originally, as far as we know, under the Hasmoneans, and then Herod the Great had expanded the fortifications up there, built a big wall around it, and built some beautiful, elaborate palaces. Some scholars think that, Masada was one of the places that Herod saw as kind of a bolt hole, an escape place, just in case, Cleopatra convinced Mark Antony, to get rid of Herod. So it was a place he could run away to. But anyway, so Masada was this place where there were these beautiful palaces, a large food supply, which had been collected over a long period of time, soldiers there with arms and armaments, people with a variety of religious views as well, apparently. One of the most interesting things I think about Masada is that in the excavations of what was clearly some sort of meeting place or synagogue, they found the remains of texts from the Hebrew Bible, also a large number of ritual baths up there, mikvot, which shows that people were attempting to keep to, purity laws and things. So, I think it's absolutely fascinating that by the time we get to the Roman siege of Masada in either 73 or 74, that essentially what we're looking at is a diverse community of Jews that included civilians, but also soldiers as well, and very likely representatives of all of the, in my view, representatives of all the main sectarian groupings as well. And then the Roman army showed up, the 10th Legion and some auxiliaries, probably around 8,000 or so soldiers, who built a circumvallation wall around the base of Masada. The circumvallation wall and the kind of the fortresses that were integrated, most of them integrated into the wall, some of them outside of it, were excavated by Israeli and American and other archaeologists, including by my friend Jody Magnus, from whom we've learned a tremendous amount about the Roman army during a short-ish siege there. So they show up and build this wall, and so I'm sure some of your listeners have visited Masada. In fact, there are not just two ways up Masada. There are many ways up Masada, but only two ways which are viable for most semi-fit human beings. The so-called snake path, which is an interesting way to go up. I've done it myself. I did it a lot more easily when I was young. But is not really the way that a Roman army would try to get up. And then on the western side, the so-called Luce, the white path, which is the remains of a natural spur, which most of the people that visit there today go up if they want to, walk up. So Josephus identifies that as the way that the Romans captured Masada, by building an embankment up the western side, and then near the top of the embankment, when they got close enough to the Herodian era wall, constructing a platform on which was put a 90-foot high siege tower, from which they could use artillery and a battering ram to break through the wall. So that's the account that Josephus follows, and he describes the Romans bringing up the siege tower, making the breach through the wall. And then when it becomes apparent that the Romans are going to be able to break through and get up on top of the wall, that Eleazar ben Yair makes a speech to the 967 men, women, and children up on top of Masada, urging them to organize a way to commit suicide, or to select a group of people who will slay the vast majority of people, and then finally have a kind of small lottery, and then only one person will have to commit suicide. And so there's a first speech about that, and then Josephus reports that not everyone was entirely enthusiastic about the plan, and he made a second speech, which includes interesting things about the immortality of the soul and all the rest of it. And then finally, everyone is convinced, and they go through with their plan. And then the next day, the Romans attack, and there's silence, and they come up on top of Masada, and they find the bodies, and 2 women and a couple of children come out from a hiding place in a cistern, that they had gone to and disclosed to the Romans what had happened up there. So that's the story that Josephus tells. There is a huge amount of scholarly controversy about whether that story can be believed or not. Very intelligent, credible scholars have sort of challenged aspects of the story. In response, other scholars have adduced evidence from the archaeological evidence which support aspects of the story. I'll just give one example. For instance, in fact, there is evidence on the Luque, or the spur, of some sort of construction of a wooden platform. So kind of an architectural enhancement of the natural spur, the stone spur, which could be consistent with the construction of a Roman-style embankment. So there is a lot of controversy about that. From my point of view, where I come out on this is that what has to be explained by people who want to challenge the fundamental Josephine story is why it is that exactly at the point where Josephus says there was a breach in the defensive wall on top of Masada, why that breach is there right at that point that he says that this is where the Romans made their breakthrough after bringing their battering ram up there. I don't see any other plausible explanation for why the breach is at that point in particular. Does it mean that all 967 people took part in the murder suicide? I'm not sure of that, and I don't know if we will ever know. Although I would also say that since Josephus circulated copies of his work, including his account of what happened at Masada, and that happened in the late 70s or early 80s, the circulation of the work, then presumably by that time, there would have been people around who had taken part in the siege of Masada and knew what happened. And if it had been an outright fabrication, then I think that there might have been people who would have pointed that out. So that ends the siege of Masada, but not, as I point out in my book, the end of the resistance. We happen to know from Josephus that either Sicarii or the followers of the Sicarii also were active in Egypt and in Libya as well. And there were kind of outbreaks of resistance there, which the Romans snuffed out. It's worth pointing out again that, in fact, probably in 73, Vespasian had decided that he wanted the temple that had been built in Egypt by Jews at Onias near Leontopolis to be closed and then eventually destroyed. And the significance of that, I think, has been really underestimated. So even if, for the sake of argument, you said that Josephus was right and Titus destroyed the temple in Jerusalem by accident, he wanted to preserve it, if he preserved it, just to play a kind of intellectual game, would the Flavians have allowed Roman-friendly priests to continue with the sacrifices on behalf of the Romans? Okay. But why, if that's the case, and it was destroyed by accident, why did the Flavians go out of their way to shut down the sacrifices going on in Egypt as well? So that says to me that the objective was to shut down the sacrificial part of Judaism. Why? Maybe because they felt that as long as the sacrifices were ongoing, that they were going to draw people to wherever those sacrifices were going to be made. There are two things that you can't do in the Roman Empire. You can't not pay your taxes, and you can't disturb the public order. Those are the two things, those are the minimum requirements for staying on the right side of the Romans. So I see the shutting down of the Egyptian temple, however heretical other Jews may have seen it as being, as pretty strong evidence that the Flavians never made being a Jew illegal. It continued to be a illicit status. But sacrifices and the sacrificial cult, they went out of their way to end.
Right. So something in general to discuss about all that is just, why does Josephus end with Masada, with this? Why does he choose to end his war revolt of the Jews with this?
I think that the right explanation for this is contained in the speeches of Eleazar. Unless those two women that survived and the children had the memories of a Homeric poet, there's no way that they could have remembered these long speeches that Eleazar made. So these are speeches that Josephus puts into the mouth of Eleazar. And if you read those speeches, which I would urge all of your listeners to do, unfortunately, the speeches are kind of all too consistent with what Josephus has had to say about who was to blame for the outbreak of the war and its disastrous end as well. So I think that the real answer to your question is that he ends with Masada, because Masada is sort of the point at which Josephus can say, especially about the Sicarii, kind of, I told you so. That's what happens to these guys, And actually, there is a bit of temerity in all of this, because he has Eleazar say, sort of, we were wrong. And God has decided not to just sort of punish us a little bit, but actually to wipe us out, to get rid of us. That's it. Which I find pretty amazing, actually. But there it is. So yeah, I think that the reason why is that it fits Josephus's hypothesis about who is responsible for the war, the tyrants, as it were, as he keeps saying, and then the punishment for it, for the sins. And then, of course, the Romans are just the instrument of it. They're God's instrument. So there it is. It just fits. It puts everything together, closes everything together.
Just one personal comment on what you said before we finish with some general questions is about Masada. You said people go how they went up. I haven't been there in a number of years, but I took the lift up. I didn't walk up. And either way you go, it's kind of hard. But I'm sure people have, like you said, he walked up. So just some general questions. I mean, in general, what was the attitude of the Romans in general to the Jews overall, whether that, overall in the Roman Empire and then to the Jews in Rome? There obviously were Jews in the city of Rome itself at this time.
I think it's almost impossible to generalize. There were certainly very prominent Romans who were both curious and sympathetic. Probably the best example is maybe the most famous Roman, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar seemed to have been interested in Judaism, in Jews, and also went out of his way to secure the status of Jews living in majority Gentile or Greco-Roman cities, to secure the sort of safe collection and transport of the temple tax. And then there are, I think, probably people who qualify as what we would call sort of anti-Semitic among Romans. So for readers who are interested in this, there's a very, very good book by a very prominent Israeli scholar called Ben Isaac, who teaches at Tel Aviv University, about kind of the origins of anti-Semitism as a kind of phenomenon of this world. I think that the war and its aftermath makes it worse, as it were, for the majority of Jews, because Jews were living all over the Greco-Roman world. And now you have a Roman dynasty that's kind of, built their prestige on defeating them. So yeah, this is sort of, I think, the beginning of a long and sad road. But it is not a road with an ending that I think that Titus and Vespasian could have anticipated.
And that's something that I think we should discuss here, because most of what we discussed on this episode was some of it maybe in part 3 and then part 4 of the book certainly, but part 5 of the book, which you term God's Plan, is 2 chapters. We have chapter 22, the causes of the war or wars, and then you have, I believe, the final chapter, the course and outcome of the war, for your final maybe conclusory chapters. So this is something that you just mentioned to discuss what were your conclusions there that you mentioned, and then obviously picking up on something that you talk about all the way at the end, which is what you just alluded to. This is what the outcome of the story today is not something that Titus and Vespasian and that they never they didn't envision that, obviously.
Right. So of course I'm hoping that a lot of people will take the time and make the effort to work their way through this sort of long book. But kind of in a nutshell, as far as the causes, course, and then outcome are concerned, basically the way I look at it is that wars are always questions of human choices. People make choices. What I was trying to do was I was trying to remind scholars and the rest of the public that the choices that people made, which led to this war, were not kind of irrational choices necessarily, especially among the Jews. We talked a lot about how the war broke out and what the events were that were leading up to it. As I always say, when you spill a lot of civilian blood and don't address that, you're playing with fire, as it were. And as far as the course of the war is concerned, there's a lot in the book, of course, about the military strategies of the two sides. And, I just want to be clear that I'm not criticizing the rebels for their strategy. I'm just suggesting that there were alternative strategies which they could have followed, which, might have yielded a different result. But of course, it's kind of a counterfactual proposition because we can't go back and replay it, as it were. But the end of the book is really about the outcome, and it's kind of where I try to sum up my ideas about what it is that the Flavians thought that they'd accomplished, and then what really did happen. So obviously, this our last podcast, we talked a little bit about what they thought they were doing with eliminating the sacrificial cult. What I very briefly argue in my book is that, the Romans sort of got it wrong. I mean, the sacrificial cult, of course, was incredibly important. It was an important part of Judaism or Judaisms, and had been for a long time. But there was something else which was much more important, which was, the Word of God, the book. And the book, as it were, was something that, in some sense, was unique among the peoples that the Romans encountered, both within and outside of their empire. The Hebrew Bible wasn't just, a book about commandments, but also kind of a national history and a history of the relations between their one and only God and the people. Nobody else had anything like that. So when the Romans wiped out, the sacrificial cult, they thought somehow that they had triumphed over this people, but in fact, behind, as it were, the building and the temple, there was this history as well, this sacred book. And books are a lot harder to wipe out. You can't bring up siege engines and a battering ram and just get rid of them. So the book, as it were, provided the inspiration and the guide for how even something as terrible as this, which was precedented because of the destruction of the first temple, of course. It was precedented and survivable as well. It was survivable. The question is, and was, how are you going to survive it? What was the interpretation of it? And it's really not for me to say what that should be. But what I can do as an outsider and as an observer is say, okay, Titus and Vespasian are gone. The Arch of Titus and the Coliseum are tourist destinations, but the retaining wall is not, and also the book is not. It's a real living sacred book. So that's why I say I think that the Flavians got it wrong. They thought that they had won, but they didn't have that longer view of what this was really about. So that's kind of where I end.
Absolutely. And that's how you end the book. So I will say, obviously, we've had a long conversation, many hours now of this series. The book is 465 pages, I believe. And then there's a few hundred pages of, there's appendices, and then there's notes. But the appendices are really fascinating. Like I said, there's the military history, and then you go through where they were, how many legionaries, how many auxiliaries, how many slaves, how much food they needed, how much liquid they needed. So anyone interested in military history, it's fascinating, besides the other things that you go through. I said it's Yale University Press. It's available on Amazon. Last I checked, again, as of this recording, it's still $26, and even list price is $45. Hardcover. It's a great price. I will say I read the book. I found it very readable, very enjoyable. There's a lot of history that people can learn. But I will ask you, just for there's this, and then also I'll put a link. The Josephus War, the Oxford Classics one is a new translation with notes. It's very readable and usable. You mentioned some other. Are there any other? Obviously, you're suggesting your own book, but is there anything else for outside of this? Any other reading that you would suggest to listeners?
Right. I mean, it sort of came up in what we were talking about today. That book by Ben Isaac about anti-Semitism and racism in the ancient world, I think is really, really interesting. I would also suggest you could Google some of the works by a couple of other friends of mine who work in Israel on this material. So Hannah Cotton, who published actually the papyri from Masada, and was one of the editors, the kind of head honchos for the publication of all of the inscriptions from Israel. Jonathan Price, a guy who's written extensively about Josephus and also inscriptions. And then, of course, Jody Magnus, who teaches at the University of North Carolina, who is a fantastic archaeologist and wrote a very good book with Princeton University. If you are interested in Masada, if you want to know, I have one chapter in my book about Masada. Jody Magnus wrote a very user-reader friendly book for Princeton University Press about Masada, which I could recommend to people.
Okay.
So those would be some suggestions.
Perfect. Perfect. Thank you. And just finally for yourself, I mean, I think you mentioned all the way in the beginning, your other books are on Alexander the Great and other things in the, not on specifically Jewish history. Are there other projects in the future that you're going to do on Jewish history? I know you mentioned that this book has many hundreds of pages left on the cutting floor. So is that something you'll turn into a book, or is there something else perhaps?
Right. I mean, there are kind of two things that I'm working on. One is that what you're referring to, which is kind of this story, the prequel, as it were, from Alexander the Great to Herod, which I think, obviously I'd be dealing with the Maccabees and sort of the Greek dynasties in the area, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And then I have another project, which is a more sort of overtly political project about the fall of the Roman Republic and the American Republic, sort of a compare and contrast thing that I'm working on.
Very interesting. Okay, well, we'll look forward. Okay. And thank you once again for coming on a number of episodes to talk about the book. And like I said, I think it was really interesting, and it was a pleasure to speak with you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.